I want you to picture something for me. You're lying in a hospital bed. You can barely lift your arm. Your body has been fighting itself for weeks. And the one person who promised to love you through sickness and health walks through that door, not with flowers, not with your favorite soup, not even with a simple "I'm here." He walks in with a lawyer. And an envelope. That was the moment I realized my marriage wasn't ending. It had already been over for a long time. I just hadn't been allowed to know it. My name is Rachel. Rachel Calloway. And before I tell you everything, I want you to understand something. I am not telling this story because I'm bitter. I am not telling it because I want sympathy or because I need the world to take my side. I'm telling it because I almost let him convince me that everything that happened was my fault. And I almost believed him. Let me take you back to the beginning. The real beginning. My husband's name was Daniel. Daniel Calloway. When I met him, I was 26 years old. He was 30. He was handsome in that quiet, serious way. The kind of man who seemed dependable. Stable. Safe. I grew up in a house where nothing was stable. My dad left when I was 9. My mom worked double shifts at a diner in Columbus, Ohio, for most of my childhood. She taught me early, not with words but with the way she lived, that you cannot depend on people to stay. So when Daniel stayed, I thought I had found something rare. We dated for 2 years. He was attentive. Thoughtful. He remembered small details. He brought me coffee exactly how I liked it without being asked. He remembered that I hated the smell of lilies even though most people brought them as gifts. He noticed things about me that I had stopped expecting anyone to notice. Looking back now, I understand that he was not attentive because he loved me. He was attentive because he was building a profile. Learning what to say. Learning what I needed to hear so I would trust him completely. And it worked. We got married in September. A small wedding in Asheville, North Carolina. 60 people. His mother, Linda, gave a toast about how much she loved me. She cried. I cried. I thought I was finally getting the family I never had. We bought a house in Charlotte. A 3-bedroom with a yard. We talked about children. We tried for children. That part is the part that still sits heaviest in my chest. We tried for 2 years before I got pregnant. 2 years of ovulation kits and temperature charts and fertility consultations and that very specific kind of hope that can only exist when you have wanted something so badly for so long that wanting it has become part of your identity. When the test came back positive, I called Daniel at work. He came home early. He held me in the kitchen and we just stood there in the middle of the room for a long time without saying anything. I was 8 weeks along when I miscarried. I will not describe what that felt like. If you have been through it, you already know. If you haven't, there are no words that would make you fully understand. What I will tell you is this: Daniel was there at the hospital when it happened. He held my hand. He cried too. And I believed, completely and without question, that we were grieving together. I did not know until much later that he was already sleeping with someone else. That the grief I thought we were sharing was only mine. 18 months after the miscarriage, I got sick. It started small. Fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. Joint pain that moved around my body like it couldn't settle anywhere. A rash across my cheekbones that my regular doctor dismissed as rosacea and sent me home. I kept working. I was a project manager at a mid-size construction firm in Charlotte. I was good at my job. My team liked me. I prided myself on never missing deadlines and never asking for more than I could deliver. Then one morning in February, I was standing in the middle of a site meeting, and the room started to tilt. I reached for the edge of the conference table. Someone said my name. And then there was the floor. I woke up in an ambulance. The diagnosis came 4 days later after a series of blood tests and imaging scans. Lupus. Systemic lupus erythematosus. An autoimmune disease where your own immune system turns against your organs. The doctor who delivered the news was named Dr. Simmons. She had the kind of calm voice that makes scary information feel slightly less terrifying. She explained that my case was moderate to severe. My kidneys were already showing signs of involvement. I needed to be hospitalized immediately for monitoring and to begin treatment. How long? I asked. At least 3 weeks, she said. Possibly longer depending on how you respond. I nodded. I looked at Daniel, who was sitting in the chair beside my bed. He was looking at his phone. I told myself he was texting his mother, letting her know what was happening so she wouldn't worry. I told myself that because it was easier than sitting with what I was actually seeing. The first week in the hospital, Daniel visited every other day. Which sounds okay on the surface. Until you remember that we lived 12 minutes from that hospital. He always had a reason. Work was busy. Traffic was bad. He had to let the dog out. He was handling the insurance paperwork and wanted to get it right so I wouldn't have to worry about it. The insurance paperwork came up a lot. 3 or 4 separate times across different conversations. I'm taking care of all of it so you can just focus on getting better. At the time, I thought he was being responsible. I thought wrong. My best friend Carla visited more than he did. She brought me magazines and crossword books and cheap nail polish, and she sat with me watching reality TV like everything was going to be fine. She made the hospital feel less like a hospital. I know now that Carla was holding information she hadn't figured out how to give me yet. I'm still working out how I feel about that. Some days I understand it. Some days I don't. My mother-in-law Linda called me every few days from her home in Greensboro. She sounded genuinely worried. She asked if I needed anything. She mentioned that Daniel seemed stressed but that I shouldn't take it personally. He feels everything deeply, Rachel. He just doesn't show it the way you do. He loves you. He's scared. I held on to that. I used it like something to keep myself warm. It kept me warm while he was upstairs planning his exit. The thing about being seriously ill in a hospital is that it removes your armor completely. You are tired in a way that is different from any tiredness you have known before. You are in pain. You are dependent on other people for basic things. You have no control over your schedule, your environment, or your body. You are also afraid. Not just of the illness. Of everything. Of what your life looks like after this. Of whether you'll feel like yourself again. Of whether the people who say they love you actually mean it when staying requires something real from them. I think about who I was in those hospital weeks and I feel a deep tenderness for her. She was trying so hard to be easy. She was telling nurses she was fine when she wasn't. She was smiling for Daniel's visits even when she could see his eyes scanning the room like he was somewhere else in his head. She was trying so hard to be easy to love. She didn't understand yet that the problem was never her. Around week 2, one of the nurses started paying closer attention to me. Her name was Donna. She was in her late 40s, matter of fact, the kind of woman who had seen every version of human behavior in a hospital and was surprised by very little of it. She began checking on me during moments that weren't strictly required. She would linger a few extra minutes. Make conversation. Ask about my family, my work, my life outside that room. One evening she came in to adjust my foreline and stayed longer than she needed to. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Of course," I said. She kept her voice low. "Your husband was here this morning asking me questions. While you were resting." I waited. "He asked me whether you had been fully conscious during your procedures. Whether the sedation we use affects memory or awareness in the hours after." She paused. "He asked specifically whether a person would have the legal capacity to sign documents or receive legal notices shortly after coming out of sedation." I felt something go very still inside me. "He asked me that?" "He did." She looked at me steadily. I thought you should know, he asked. She left the room. I lay in the dark for a long time after that. And something that had been sleeping inside me for weeks opened its eyes. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, Daniel came to the hospital. I had been sedated earlier that morning for a procedure to evaluate my kidney function. I was still slow. Still foggy. My thoughts were moving like they were traveling through something thick. He walked in. He was not alone. A man I did not recognize walked in behind him. Suit. Briefcase. That specific professional blankness that certain people carry when they are performing a function and want you to know it is nothing personal. Rachel. Daniel's voice was completely steady. Completely controlled. I'm sorry. I've been waiting to tell you this. But I can't keep waiting. The man set an envelope on my bedside table. You've been served, he said. Quietly. Efficiently. And then he stepped back. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Daniel. My first thought was that this was a mistake. That I was still sedated and my brain was constructing something that made no sense. That Daniel was going to reach over and squeeze my hand and say there had been some terrible mix-up. He did not reach over. He did not step closer. He stood near the doorway like he needed a clear path out. Daniel, I said. My voice came out slower than I wanted it to. What is this? I think you already know, he said. Tell me anyway. I've filed for divorce. My attorney will reach out to yours. I didn't have an attorney. He knew that. I was in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm. Daniel. I'm sorry, he said. I really am. And he walked out. The man in the suit followed him. The door swung shut. I lay there with that envelope on my chest and I felt something I had never felt before. Not just hurt. Not just shock. Not even betrayal in the ordinary sense of that word. I felt the very specific, very cold feeling of realizing that someone had looked at your absolute lowest moment and seen a tactical opportunity. He had not come to check on me. He had come because he had planned this. He had waited for the sedation. He had researched my legal capacity with my own nurse. He had timed the service to a 2-hour window after a procedure because he wanted to catch me when I was least able to respond. This was not impulsive. This had been thought through. And that realization, more than the papers themselves, more than the words on that document, was what changed something fundamental inside me. Here's what I found out in the days that followed. My phone was gone. I had left it in Daniel's care when I was admitted because the battery was nearly dead and the charger was at home. When I asked him to bring it back, he said he had sent it to be repaired. The screen had a crack. He was just taking care of it. When I finally got access to a hospital landline and tried to log into my email using a borrowed computer at the nurse's station, my password had been changed. The joint bank account app. Changed. The cloud storage where I kept my personal documents and photos. Changed. He had quietly locked me out of my own digital life while I was sedated and alone. I sat with that information for a long moment. My joints were aching. My kidneys were still being watched. I was exhausted down to a level I didn't know exhaustion could reach. And I made a decision. I was not going to fall apart. Not because I wasn't devastated. I was. There were nights in that hospital where I cried so quietly that the walls didn't even know. There were mornings where opening my eyes felt like too much to ask. But I was a project manager. I knew how to handle complicated situations with a large number of moving parts. I knew how to make lists. I knew how to document things carefully. I knew how to stay methodical when every emotion in my body was screaming at me to be chaotic. So that is what I did. I started at the very beginning. A hospital social worker named Patricia came to see me about discharge planning. She was checking whether I had support at home for when I left. I told her I was going through a divorce. She didn't react with pity or shock. She just nodded and said, "Let me get you some resources." One of those resources was a legal aid clinic that specifically worked with patients facing legal complications during hospitalization. The attorney they connected me with was a woman named Barbara Ellis. She was 52 years old. Sharp in a way that didn't announce itself. The kind of sharp that looks like patience until the moment it doesn't. She came to the hospital. She sat in the plastic chair beside my bed. She looked at the divorce papers for a long time without saying anything. "When were you served?" she asked. "February 19th. About 2 hours after I came out of sedation." She wrote that down. "Do you have documentation of the sedation timing?" "The hospital does. And Donna, one of the nurses, she'll talk to you." Barbara wrote that down too. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start from the beginning. Don't edit and don't summarize. Just talk." And for the first time since all of this began, I talked. While I was talking to Barbara inside that hospital room, the world outside was getting a very different version of this story. Daniel had posted on Facebook. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years sent me a screenshot. He had posted a photo of himself. Serious expression. Soft lighting. The kind of photo that takes several attempts to look effortless. The caption read, "Going through the hardest season of our lives right now. Praying for healing and strength. So grateful for everyone who has reached out with love and support during this painful time." 47 comments underneath it. "You are such a good man, Daniel. Prayers for you both. She's lucky to have you. Stay strong. You're doing everything right." He was performing the grief of a devoted husband standing by his sick wife. He was posting about our hardest season while I was alone in a hospital room trying to figure out why I couldn't log into my own email. He was collecting sympathy for a marriage he had already legally ended. I read every one of those comments. And I felt something move through me that was so clean and so precise that it almost felt like fuel. Because anger, I could use. Barbara filed an emergency motion within 48 hours. She argued that service of divorce papers had been deliberately timed to exploit a period of diminished legal capacity. She requested the hospital provide full procedure logs documenting the exact timing of my sedation. She also requested a financial forensic audit of all marital assets. That last one was the move Daniel had not prepared for. Because here is what he did not think I knew. 3 months before I collapsed at work, he had started moving money. He had come home one evening with a stack of documents he described as insurance updates. He said we were reorganizing our life insurance policies and consolidating some accounts for tax efficiency. He needed my signature in a few places. He pointed to the lines. I signed. I trusted him. I did not read every page. Those documents were not just insurance updates. Hidden inside the paperwork, tucked into the language of a policy restructuring form, was a transfer authorization that moved a significant portion of our joint savings into a solo account in his name. He had also been withdrawing cash over several months. Small amounts. Patient amounts. Never large enough to trigger an automatic alert. Just steady and quiet and invisible if you weren't specifically looking for a pattern. He had been draining our shared finances the same way he had been planning everything else. Slowly. Carefully. So that by the time I was in a position to notice, it would look like there had never been much there to begin with. The forensic accountant Barbara hired was a quiet man named Gerald. He wore reading glasses and spoke in the measured tone of someone who has uncovered 1,000 financial deceptions and is no longer capable of being surprised by any of them. He found the trail in less than 2 weeks. He's been moving assets for at least 7 months, Gerald told Barbara. 7 months. I had been trying to get pregnant 5 months before I collapsed. He had been planning to leave while we were still actively trying to have a child together. I have had to put that particular piece of information down and walk away from it many times. I'm not sure I have ever fully picked it back up. Then came the custody filing. We had no children. But we had our dog, Murphy. A rescue greyhound we had adopted together 3 years earlier. Long legs, velvet ears, the gentle confused expression of a creature who has been through difficult things and is just grateful to be warm. In North Carolina, pets are legally considered property in a divorce. But that is not what the custody filing was actually about. Daniel filed a motion claiming I was mentally unstable. He cited my hospitalization. He referenced what he called my history of emotional difficulties. He submitted a declaration stating he had serious concerns about my ability to function independently and make sound decisions. He was trying to use my illness as a weapon. He was trying to build a legal record that would make everything I said about him look like the words of an unstable, unreliable woman. He had thought ahead. He had gotten to people before I could. He had framed the story in advance so that when I started telling my version, there would already be a competing version in place. He was good at this. I understood that clearly for the first time. He had been good at this for years. And then I found out about Ashley. Her name was Ashley Monroe. She was 29 years old. She worked at a fertility clinic in Charlotte called New Horizons Reproductive Center. I found out about her from the source that hurt me second most in this entire story. Carla. My best friend Carla came to visit me about 3 weeks into my hospitalization. She was quieter than usual. She sat at the edge of my bed and she had the look of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and has finally run out of the strength to keep holding it alone. I need to tell you something, she said. And I need you to know before I say it that I am so sorry. I am so sorry I didn't come to you sooner. Carla, I said. Just say it. She took a breath. I know Ashley Monroe. We went to college together. We're in the same online group, one of those private Facebook groups from our sorority days. About 8 months ago, she posted in the group asking if anyone knew a good family law attorney in Charlotte. Carla stopped. Swallowed. I didn't think anything of it at the time. But then a few weeks later she started posting photos. Couple photos. She never tagged him. But I recognized him, Rachel. I recognized him from your Facebook. I was very still. I should have told you immediately, she said. I kept telling myself I was probably wrong. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself maybe it was nothing. I kept finding reasons to wait and I waited too long and I am so sorry. How long? I asked. How long had the photos been going on?
The first ones I saw were about 9 months ago. But knowing Ashley, based on how she was writing about him in the group, I think it started before that. 9 months ago. Possibly longer. Before the asset transfers. Before the insurance paperwork. Before my miscarriage. Maybe during my miscarriage. There are some thoughts I have learned to set a boundary around. That is one of them. I cannot go there and come back intact, so I choose not to go there at all. Ashley Monroe worked at New Horizons Reproductive Center. The same clinic where Daniel and I had done our fertility consultations. He had met her there. During our appointments. During the period when we were trying to rebuild something after our loss. While I sat in waiting rooms believing we were fighting for the same future, he had been having a different conversation entirely with someone who worked in that building. And now, according to what Barbara discovered through legal discovery, Ashley was pregnant. She had mentioned it in that same online group 3 weeks before I was hospitalized. She had not named the father. Daniel's legal filings mentioned the possibility of future children as a factor in the financial restructuring he was requesting. He had been building a replacement life. New woman. New baby. New house. Funded by money we had built together. He had timed everything so carefully. He had moved so methodically. He had been so patient. What he hadn't planned for was me being patient too. The courtroom did not look the way it looks in movies. There was no dramatic moment where someone in the gallery gasped. No confession. No breakdown. No single explosive reveal. It was quieter than that. And somehow, the quietness made it worse for him. The judge was a woman named Judge Carol Hadley. She had the focused, unhurried energy of someone who has heard every version of every story and has developed a very accurate sense of which ones are true. Daniel's attorney was working hard. He was arguing that the asset transfers were legitimate financial planning. That Daniel had been the primary financial manager in the marriage and had made reasonable preparations for an anticipated separation. Barbara stood up. She presented the hospital procedure logs. She presented the timestamp showing that Daniel had called the process server the morning before my sedation procedure. She presented Donna's written statement about Daniel's specific questions regarding my cognitive clarity and legal capacity following sedation. She presented Gerald's forensic audit. 7 months of transfers. The cash withdrawals. The disguised authorization paperwork. All of it laid out in a clean, factual table. Judge Hadley looked at Daniel over the top of her reading glasses. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Is it your testimony that you were unaware your wife had undergone a sedation procedure when you arranged for her to be served?" His attorney leaned in. They whispered. Mr. Calloway had no intention of. "I asked Mr. Calloway," Judge Hadley said. A pause that went on a beat too long. "I was aware of her medical schedule," Daniel said carefully. "But I did not believe the sedation would affect her legal capacity to receive service." Judge Hadley looked at him for a long moment. "You researched her legal capacity," she said. "You specifically asked hospital staff about her cognitive clarity in relation to legal documents. And you arranged for service to occur within 2 hours of a sedation procedure." She waited to see if he would add anything. He did not. "The court finds that service was deliberately timed with the intent to exploit a period of diminished capacity," she said. "The original service is void. We will proceed from that position." That was the moment. No explosion. No drama. Just a door swinging shut on everything he thought he had secured. The financial audit findings were entered into evidence. Judge Hadley ordered full disclosure of all marital assets. The disguised transfers were classified as intentional marital asset concealment. Gerald's report documented every transaction. The timeline was clear. The intent was clear. Daniel had come into that courtroom presenting himself as the responsible one. The steady one. The financially careful partner who had been managing their shared resources while his wife recovered from a serious illness. The audit showed he had been managing their resources for his own benefit, in secret, for 7 months. The settlement that followed was not the settlement he had planned. Not even close. "I want to tell you about Linda. My mother-in-law had called me throughout my hospitalization with what sounded like genuine concern. She had defended Daniel repeatedly. She had passed along his framing without questioning it. She had told me he felt everything deeply, that he was scared, that he loved me. She had been a pipeline for his narrative without knowing it. After the court proceedings became a matter of public record, Linda called me again. Her voice was different. It had a weight to it that hadn't been there before. "Rachel," she said. "I didn't know about the money. I want you to know that. He told me you two had grown apart. He told me the marriage had been struggling for a long time and that you were the one who had become difficult. He told me Ashley was someone he met after things had already fallen apart between you. I let that sit. He told me you wanted out too," she said quietly. More silence. "Linda," I said. "I was hospitalized with lupus. He served me divorce papers 2 hours after I came out of sedation. He changed all my passwords while I was in the hospital. He had been moving our money for 7 months." She didn't say anything for a long time. When she did speak, her voice was very small. "I let him tell me what to believe," she said. "I didn't ask the right questions. I should have asked the right questions. I accepted her apology. Not for his sake. Not even entirely for hers. For mine. Because holding that particular anger was expensive and I was done spending my energy on things that only cost me. Now I want to tell you what happened to Daniel. Not because I went looking for it. Not because I tracked him or wished destruction over him in the middle of the night. But because reality has a way of being very precise with people who have been very dishonest for a very long time. And Daniel had been dishonest for a very long time. The first thing that happened was the firm. Daniel worked as a senior financial advisor at a wealth management company called Hargrove and Associates in Charlotte. He had been there 6 years. He was well liked. Well trusted. He was on an informal partnership track. The kind of professional life that looks effortless from the outside because it has been carefully tended from the inside. Gerald's forensic audit report had been submitted to the court as required by law. Court records in North Carolina are public. Anyone who searched Daniel Calloway's name could find documentation of deliberate financial concealment. Asset transfers designed to disguise their purpose. Documents signed by a spouse under false pretenses. None of it was criminal. All of it was documented. All of it was permanently searchable. Hargrove and Associates ran a compliance alert, as wealth management firms are required to do when employees are involved in legal proceedings with financial misconduct findings. He was not fired immediately. Firms like that are careful. What happened instead was slower and in some ways more complete than a firing. He was quietly removed from the partnership track. His client-facing responsibilities were reduced. He was no longer included in the dinners where important relationships were built. He was no longer being developed for anything. He was being managed out. Professionally. Politely. Without anyone ever saying directly why. Just a series of small, undeniable signals that collectively meant one thing. The worst part, for a man like Daniel, was that he could not respond to it. He could not defend himself without drawing more attention to the very thing he needed people to forget. So he had to absorb it quietly. Had to sit in meetings where he used to command the room and feel the exact size of what he had lost. He stayed for 8 months. Then he left. He told people it was a strategic career move. He spent 4 months trying to find a comparable position at another firm. Most firms that ran standard background checks found the same public court record. He eventually landed at a smaller firm. Fewer clients. Less prestige. A salary that represented a meaningful step backward. He told people it was a good opportunity. Nobody entirely believed him. That is how these things work. Not a headline. Not a dramatic public exposure. Just a quiet, permanent reclassification of how the professional world sees you. The kind that follows you into every new room before you've said a single word. The second thing that happened was Ashley. She left before the settlement was finalized. But what I didn't know when I first told you that was the full shape of how she left. Ashley had believed Daniel's version of me completely. She had believed I was emotionally unstable. That I was the difficult one. That the marriage had crumbled because of me and that she was entering a situation where the painful part was already behind them. When the court proceedings became public and she could read, clearly, what had actually happened. The sedation timing, the forensic audit, the disguised paperwork, the 7 months of methodical financial concealment, she understood something important. She understood that Daniel was very skilled at building versions of reality that served him. She also discovered, through Barbara's legal discovery process, that Daniel had described her in his own filings as a transitional relationship that became more serious than originally intended. He had written that. About her. In a legal document. She found out. There is a specific kind of devastation that comes from reading, in black and white, in a legal filing written by the person you trusted, that you were not the thing you thought you were to them. She left. Completely. No gradual cooling. She simply stopped. I do not know the full details of what happened with the pregnancy. That is her private experience and it is not mine to share. What I know is that by the time Daniel's life had fully reshuffled, he was entirely alone. Not the temporary alone of someone between chapters. The specific kind of alone that accumulates when you have shown enough people enough of who you really are, and the pool of people willing to believe the next version of you has become very small. The third consequence was the fertility clinic. Ashley had worked at New Horizons Reproductive Center. She had met Daniel there during our fertility consultations. And during Barbara's discovery process, it emerged that Ashley had accessed our patient file on multiple occasions that were outside her professional responsibilities. She had looked at our records, our timeline, our treatment notes, our private medical history. I do not know exactly what she was looking for. I have theories. I will not say them out loud. What I know is that New Horizons discovered the access during their own internal review. They disclosed it to me directly, through Barbara, as part of a process that ended with Ashley no longer being employed at that clinic. The place where Daniel and I had sat in waiting rooms holding hands and hoping. That is where he had found her. That is what was happening on the other side of those appointments. I have put that particular truth down and picked it back up many times. I don't know if I will ever fully know what to do with it. But I also know that Daniel had been very careful about so many things. He had not been careful about that. And the one thing he failed to control was the thread that unraveled everything on her side of the story. He thought he had closed every door. He had left that one open. Sometimes that is all it takes. The fourth thing was Linda. I told you about her apology. About her quiet voice on the phone. About her saying she should have asked the right questions. What I didn't tell you is what happened after that call. She called Daniel. I don't know every word of that conversation. She told me pieces of it over the following months, in the careful, halting way that a person speaks when they are still processing something that hurt them at the level of identity. She had asked him directly. About the sedation. About the paperwork I had signed. About Ashley. About the timeline. About how long. He had explained. He had framed. He had tried to build a version that made the facts sound reasonable. And Linda, who had known her son for 34 years, who had loved him fiercely and without condition, who had cried at our wedding with complete sincerity, Linda could see exactly what he was doing. She had seen him do it his whole life. She had just never been the one he was doing it to before. She told him she needed time. That was more than 8 months ago now. She still calls me occasionally. Not often. Not in a way that feels like choosing sides. In a way that feels like a woman trying to hold on to something honest when the person she loves most has made honesty very complicated. She asks about my health. She asks about Murphy. She does not ask about Daniel. And I think that particular silence, that specific absence in a mother's conversation about her own son, is something he feels every single day in a way that no financial penalty and no professional consequence could quite replicate. The fifth thing was the Facebook posts. He left them up too long. That was his real mistake. The one that cost him the narrative he had worked hardest to protect. The devoted husband posts. The soft lighting. The prayer hands. The 47 comments from people who didn't know. He left them up for almost 4 months after the court proceedings became public record. I believe he thought the narrative would hold if he just stayed quiet and waited. That distance and time would let the image survive. But information travels in a city like Charlotte. Not in announcements. In conversations. In the accumulated weight of one person telling another person who tells someone else. Someone who had read the court records left a comment on one of the devotion posts. Short. Simple. Something like, "This post did not age well." That comment was visible for less than an hour before Daniel deleted it. But an hour is long enough. Screenshots were taken. The screenshots spread the way screenshots always spread. Quietly. Through direct messages and private group chats. Shared with the specific energy of people who feel they are passing along something that needs to be seen. He deleted all the posts the next day. Cleared his feed of everything related to our marriage. The carefully tended public image of a devoted husband just vanished overnight. People noticed the deletion. People always notice the deletion. The sudden absence of a years-long narrative says something that no post ever could. It says, I needed you to believe something that was not true, and now I need you to forget that I asked. His social presence went almost entirely quiet after that. The version of Daniel Calloway that had existed online for years. The curated, polished, respected version, simply stopped. From the outside, that looks like one thing. It looks like guilt. The sixth thing was the dinner. About 6 months after my settlement was finalized, I was invited to a birthday celebration for a mutual friend. A woman named Gina who had been close to both Daniel and me during our marriage and had quietly, without making it a statement, stayed close to me after. I went with a woman from my lupus support group named Diane. She has the kind of quiet courage that makes you braver just by standing near her. Daniel was already there when we arrived. He had not been told I would be coming. Neither had I known he would be there. I saw him see me from across the room. And I watched him go through the calculation that people go through in those moments. The rapid and visible assessment of the situation. Who is watching? What the room knows. What move is available? Then I watched him realize there was no good move. Because the people at that table had been in Charlotte long enough and knew enough overlapping people to have absorbed enough of the truth over time. Not in a formal way. Not through a conversation anyone had deliberately started. Just through the slow accumulation of information that happens in a city where circles overlap and people talk. He sat through the dinner. He was quieter than I had ever seen him in a social setting. Daniel had always been good in rooms. Charming. Easy. The kind of person who made other people feel warm and interesting and lucky to know him. That version of himself was completely absent. In its place was someone who measured every sentence before saying it and still looked uncertain about whether any of them were safe. He left before the cake came out. Said he had an early morning. After he left, nobody said much about it. Nobody called after him. Nobody said, tell us what you've been up to, or, we should all get together soon. The table just continued without him. And that seamless continuation, the absence of a gap where he used to be, I think is the truest measure of what he had cost himself. Not the money, though that changed. Not the job, though that changed too. Not even Ashley, though that hurt him. What he lost was the automatic assumption of goodness. The baseline of trust that makes life in a community feel easy. The thing you never notice you have until the moment it's gone, because you've never had to earn it consciously before. He had spent years carefully managing how people perceived him. Now he would spend a long time in rooms where people had already made up their minds. That is the real punishment for someone built the way Daniel was built. Not a sentence. Not a headline. Just the permanent experience of being seen. I want to tell you where I am now. Not the life I imagined. Not the family I lost and grieved. Not the version of myself who signed documents she didn't fully read because she trusted the person handing her the pen. I am better. Not in the easy, quick way that gets posted online. In the real way. The kind that comes from going through something that tried to break you and choosing, every single day, not to let it make you smaller. My lupus is managed. Dr. Simmons and I have found a treatment approach that works. I know my body now the way you only learn to know something after it has asked something difficult of you. I know my warning signs. I know when to rest. I have stopped apologizing for having limits. I moved into a smaller apartment on my own. It is mine. Only mine. I know where everything is and nothing has been moved without my knowledge, and every password is one I chose myself. Murphy is with me. He sleeps at the end of my bed and sometimes completely across the middle of it in a way that defies the geometry of his body. He leans against my legs when he senses I am having a hard moment. He has no idea what happened. He just knows that every morning and every evening I am there. That is enough. That is more than enough. I stayed in contact with Nurse Donna. I sent flowers when I was discharged and I wrote her a letter. She probably doesn't know the full shape of what her quiet courage that night set in motion. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it to her properly. I am still in therapy. Real therapy. The kind that helps you understand yourself rather than just feel better in the moment. I am not ashamed of that. I am not ashamed of any part of needing help. I joined a lupus support group that meets virtually every other Tuesday evening. The people in that group are some of the most genuinely brave people I have ever encountered. They have taught me that illness does not have to define you. It can clarify you. It can strip away everything that was only there because you were afraid to let it go. Carla and I are still rebuilding. Slowly. It's complicated territory. She knew something and she waited too long to tell me. She also sat beside me through the worst weeks of my life and never once made me feel like a burden. People are not simple. I am trying to hold both things at once and let the relationship be what it actually is rather than what I need it to be. I am working on that. I think about the woman in that hospital bed sometimes. I think about her lying there still foggy from sedation, watching the door swing shut, holding an envelope she hadn't opened yet. Trying to make sense of something that made no sense. Trying to find a version of events where this wasn't as bad as it looked. I want to say something to her. Every quiet decision you made in the weeks that followed mattered. Every time you chose documentation over panic, structure over chaos, patience over reaction, it mattered. The moment you decided not to fall apart, not because you weren't shattered, but because falling apart was exactly what he had counted on. That moment changed the entire outcome. You could not stand up in that hospital bed. But you were already standing. There are people in this world who look at your love and your trust and your willingness to believe the best about them, and they treat those things as weaknesses to be used. They study you. They time their moves. They build the story before you know there's a story being built. And they almost always believe they've won. They almost always walk away thinking they've gotten away with it. What Daniel never understood, what that kind of person almost never understands, is that the truth does not need your help to surface. It just needs time. And patience. And one ordinary person with enough basic decency to say, I thought you should know. He served me papers when I was at my most vulnerable. Sedated. Alone. Afraid. Locked out of my own life. He walked out of that room believing the story was already written. He forgot that I was the one who knew how to manage complicated situations with a lot of moving parts. He forgot that patience was never his strength. It was always mine. He handed me that envelope thinking he was closing a door. He was handing me the key to every door he thought he'd locked. And I had been walking through them ever since.